Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
2 weeks ago, my dad sat me down at the dining table and said, I need to tell you something I've been hiding for 30 years. I thought it was going to be something innocent, like a secret hobby or a funny story from his past. But instead, he told me about a crime he committed, one that changed everything I thought I knew about him and our family. It started on an ordinary Friday night. My dad and I had just finished dinner, a quiet meal of spaghetti and garlic bread. My mom was out of town, visiting her sister, and the house felt unusually still. Normally, Dad would be cracking jokes or sharing stories about his day. But tonight, he was uncharacteristically quiet. He sat across the table, fiddling with his glass of wine, the sound of the ice clinking against the glass the only noise breaking the silence. I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. Everything okay, Dad? He sighed, long and heavy, like he was carrying a weight too big for his shoulders. You're old enough now, he finally said, his voice low. I think you deserve the truth. My heart skipped a beat. The way he said it made my stomach flip, but I forced a laugh, hoping to lighten the mood. What? You're secretly a spy, or something? He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. Instead, he set his glass down with a deliberate clink and looked me straight in the eyes. No jokes, kid. This is serious. That was when the uneasiness started to creep in. The man sitting across from me, the one who had always been my rock, suddenly looked different. Smaller, maybe? Vulnerable. He took a deep breath and started to speak. When I was in my 20s before I met your mom, I made a lot of stupid choices. One night, me and a couple of my friends, we broke into a jewelry store. I blinked at him, waiting for the punchline. But there was none. His words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Wait, what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his face pale. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. Just smash and grab, you know? But things got out of hand. He stopped, rubbing his hands over his face like he was trying to scrub the memory away. We didn't just rob the place. We accidentally set it on fire. For a moment, I couldn't speak. It felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. My dad, the man who always lectured me about honesty and responsibility, had just confessed to being a criminal. Well, what do you mean, accidentally? I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking. He shook his head, his expression a mix of regret and shame. One of the guys brought a can of lighter fluid. We were trying to destroy some evidence. I didn't think it would catch like that, but it did. The fire spread so fast. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. My mind was racing. This couldn't be real. My dad was the guy who volunteered at the local food bank, who went to every single one of my soccer games. He wasn't this. Was anyone hurt? I asked, dreading the answer. He hesitated, and that hesitation made my blood run cold. No one died, he said, which should have been a relief. But the way he said it didn't feel reassuring. But a firefighter got hurt trying to put out the blaze. The store owner lost everything. I stared at him, my thoughts spiraling. This wasn't just some dumb mistake. This was arson. This was so much worse than anything I could have imagined. Why are you telling me this now? I finally asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. Because I can't keep it inside anymore. I've been carrying this guilt for 30 years, and it's eating me alive. I need you to know the truth. In case it ever comes out. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? The man I thought I knew was suddenly a stranger. My chest felt tight, and my mind was a jumble of questions I couldn't even begin to untangle. We sat in silence for what felt like hours. Eventually, he stood up, patting me awkwardly on the shoulder before heading upstairs. I just sat there at the table, staring at his half-empty glass of wine, my world spinning. This was just the beginning, and I had no idea how much worse it was going to get. The next morning, I woke up hoping it had all been a bad dream. But when I walked downstairs, the sight of my dad sitting at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched and his face lined with worry, brought it all rushing back. Morning, kid, he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual warmth. I didn't respond. I grabbed a mug from the cabinet and poured myself some coffee, even though I didn't want it. I just needed something to do with my hands. I sat down across from him, the tension between us almost unbearable. You're mad, he said, more of a statement than a question. Of course I'm mad, I snapped, surprising even myself with the sharpness of my tone. You dropped a bomb on me last night, Dad. What do you expect? He nodded slowly, staring into his coffee. I know. I deserve that. For a moment, I debated just getting up and leaving, but the question swirling in my mind wouldn't let me go. So, what happened after the fire? You said no one died, but was anyone else hurt? He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with regret. The firefighter who got injured, his name was Peter Sullivan. He broke his leg when part of the roof collapsed on him. I remember reading about it in the papers the next day. He recovered, thank God, but the store owner, he lost his entire livelihood. His name was Mr. Patel. He'd poured his life savings into that store, and we took it all away from him. I felt a lump forming in my throat. And you just walked away? You didn't try to help? You didn't confess? He shook his head, his face pale. We were scared. I was scared. I didn't light the fire, but I was there. I didn't stop it. If I went to the police, I would have gone down with the others. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. So, you just let someone else take the fall? His head snapped up, his eyes wide. No one took the fall, not for that. The cops never figured out who did it. There was an investigation, but we covered our tracks pretty well, or so we thought. They questioned a few people, but nothing ever stuck. Then why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice trembling. He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. Because I've been living with this guilt for 30 years. Every time I see a firefighter, every time I drive past a jewelry store, it all comes flooding back. I can't keep it inside anymore. I thought maybe if I told you, it would feel less heavy. Why me? I asked, my anger bubbling to the surface again. Why not Mom? Or a priest? Someone who could actually help you? He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he said, because I trust you. And because I don't know how to tell your mom. She's always seen me as this good guy, you know? The guy who does the right thing. I didn't want to destroy that image for her. I scoffed, shaking my head. So, you're just going to dump it all on me and hope I can keep it together? That's your plan? I'm sorry, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't mean for it to come out like this. I couldn't carry it alone anymore. The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I didn't know what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him how selfish he was for dragging me into this. But another part of me, a smaller, quieter part, felt a pang of sympathy. He looked so broken, so unlike the dad I thought I knew. What about the others? I asked finally, my voice softer now. Your friends. What happened to them? He rubbed his hands together, his expression dark. We all went our separate ways not long after it happened. One of them, Jason, got caught a few years later for something unrelated. Petty theft, I think. The other guy, Mark, I haven't heard from him in decades. Last I heard, he moved out west. And they just moved on? Like it never happened? Maybe, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. I can only speak for myself. And I haven't had a single day of peace since that night. We sat there in silence for a long time, the clock ticking softly in the background. I didn't know what to say, and it seemed like he didn't either. Eventually, he stood up, placing a hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry, kid, he said again. I'll tell your mom soon. I promise. But I need to figure out how to do it without tearing everything apart. I didn't respond. I just stared down at my coffee, the steam swirling in lazy patterns, trying to process the enormity of what he'd just told me. As he walked out of the kitchen, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion. But most of all, I felt a sense of dread. This was bigger than me, bigger than our family. And I had a sinking feeling it was only going to get worse. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. Every time I thought about the conversation with Dad, my chest tightened and a cold wave of anxiety swept over me. I tried to shake it off as I got ready for the day, but the memory of his confession was like an itch I couldn't scratch. When I finally went downstairs, he was already sitting at the table, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone like everything was normal. But it wasn't. It would never be normal again. Morning, he said, glancing up at me. His tone was casual, like we hadn't just shattered the foundation of my entire world the night before. I didn't respond. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him, studying his face. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. But what struck me the most was how calm he seemed, like he'd made peace with his confession and was ready to move on. I wasn't. Does Mom know? I asked abruptly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He froze, his hand halfway to his mug. No, he said after a long pause. I told you I'd talk to her soon. When? I pressed, my voice sharp. She has a right to know, Dad. She deserves to know. I will, he said, his tone defensive now. I need to figure out how to do it the right way. I shook my head, pushing my chair back and standing up. You can't keep this a secret forever. If you don't tell her, I will. His face fell, and for a moment, he looked genuinely hurt. Please, just give me a little more time, he said. I'll tell her. I promise. I didn't respond. I grabbed my mug and walked out of the room, leaving him sitting there in silence. Later that afternoon, I found Mom in the living room, folding laundry while one of her favorite true crime shows played in the background. The irony wasn't lost on me. Hey, Mom, I said, hesitating in the doorway. She glanced up at me and smiled. Hey, sweetie, what's up? I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I need to talk to you about something. It's about Dad. Her smile faltered, and she set the laundry down, her full attention now on me. What's wrong? Is he okay? I sat down on the couch, my hands trembling. He told me something last night, something from his past. I could see the worry in her eyes, but she waited for me to continue. He said that when he was in his 20s, he and some friends broke into a jewelry store, I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. And they set it on fire. Her reaction was immediate. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. What? She whispered, her voice trembling. He said no one was supposed to get hurt. I continued, my own voice shaking now. But a firefighter was injured, and the store owner lost everything. He's been carrying the guilt all these years, and he finally told me last night. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face pale and her hands trembling. Then, without a word, she stood up and walked out of the room. That evening, the confrontation I'd been dreading finally happened. I was in my room when I heard raised voices coming from downstairs. My stomach dropped as I hurried to the top of the stairs, my heart racing. You lied to me? Mom's voice echoed through the house, filled with anger and pain. I didn't lie. Dad shot back, his voice defensive. I just didn't tell you. Don't play semantics with me, she screamed. You've been keeping this from me for 30 years. How could you do this? How could you let me marry you, have kids with you, and never tell me the truth about who you are? I was young and stupid. Dad yelled, his voice cracking. I made a mistake, okay? A horrible, terrible mistake. But I'm not that person anymore. That doesn't make it better, she shouted. It doesn't erase what you did or the fact that you kept it from me for our entire marriage. I sat at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding as their argument continued. I'd never heard them fight like this before. It was raw and ugly, and every word felt like a knife to the chest. You had no right to keep this from me, Mom said, her voice quieter now, but no less intense. No right. Do you have any idea what this does to us? To our family? I'm sorry, Dad said, his voice filled with emotion. I'm so sorry. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to lose you. I thought if you knew, you'd leave me. Her silence was deafening. When I finally worked up the courage to go downstairs, I found her sitting on the couch, her face streaked with tears. Dad was nowhere to be seen. I sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. After a long moment, she turned to me, her expression a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. Did you know? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I shook my head. He only told me last night. I didn't know how to tell you. I'm sorry. She nodded slowly, wiping her tears away. This isn't just his burden anymore, she said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. It's all of ours. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, the weight of her words settling over me. Our family had been forever changed, and I had no idea how or if we'd ever recover. The family meeting was Dad's idea, though it took some convincing to get everyone in the same room. My brother, Jake, wasn't thrilled about coming back home for it, and my sister, Emily, seemed skeptical about the whole thing. But Dad insisted. He said we needed to address things head-on as a family. I'll admit, I was dreading it. Reliving the shock of his confession was the last thing I wanted, and I could only imagine how Jake and Emily were going to take it. Still, by the time Saturday afternoon rolled around, we were all gathered in the living room, the air so thick with tension you could practically choke on it. Dad stood in front of the fireplace, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. He looked at each of us, his eyes heavy with guilt and sadness. Thanks for coming, he started, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. I know this isn't easy, but it's something I have to do. Jake crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. This better be good, Dad. I don't drive 3 hours for just anything. Emily shot him a look, but Dad held up a hand. He has every right to be upset. You all do. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. There's no easy way to say this, so I'm just going to come out with it. When I was in my 20s, I committed a crime, a serious one. The room fell silent. Jake raised an eyebrow, while Emily leaned forward, her brows knitted in concern. What kind of crime? Jake finally asked, his tone sharp. Dad swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. I broke into a jewelry store with some friends. We were young, stupid, and reckless. We thought we'd get away with it, but things went wrong. Very wrong. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Jake sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean, went wrong? Jake asked. There was a fire, Dad admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. A firefighter got hurt, and the store owner lost everything. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating and oppressive. You're kidding, Jake said finally, his voice laced with disbelief. Please tell me you're kidding. Dad shook his head, his face pale. I wish I were. I've been carrying this for 30 years, and I couldn't keep it inside anymore. You deserve to know the truth. Emily was the first to break the silence. Why didn't you tell us sooner? She asked, her voice trembling. Why now? I didn't want to burden you, Dad said, his voice cracking. I thought I could move on, but I couldn't. The guilt has been eating me alive, and I needed to tell someone. I needed you to know. Jake let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. So what? You just dump it on us and hope we'll be okay with it? Is that your plan? I don't expect you to be okay with it, Dad said, his voice filled with regret. I didn't want to keep lying to you. Jake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. All these years, I've looked up to you. I've tried to be like you. And now you're telling me you're a criminal? Jake, sit down, Emily said, her tone firm but calm. No, Jake snapped. I'm not sitting here and pretending this is okay. I'm out of here. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, making everyone flinch. Emily sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. This is a lot, she said finally. I don't even know where to start. Ask me anything, Dad said quickly. I'll answer whatever you want to know. Why didn't you turn yourself in? She asked, her voice laced with pain. Why didn't you do the right thing? I was scared, Dad admitted, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I was young and stupid, and I didn't want to go to jail. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would all go away. But it didn't, Emily said, her voice soft. No, Dad said, shaking his head. It never went away. Not for a single day. The rest of the meeting was a blur. Emily asked more questions, her voice steady, but her eyes filled with sadness. I stayed quiet for the most part, trying to process everything all over again. By the time it was over, we all felt more drained than before. As we headed to bed that night, the silence in the house was deafening. It felt like we were all walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing and set off another explosion. For the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't know my own family. And I couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. The days following the family meeting were a haze of awkward silences and heavy emotions. No one seemed to know how to act. Jake hadn't returned any of my texts, and Emily was too caught up in her own thoughts to say much. Mom barely spoke to Dad, and when she did, it was curt and clipped, like she couldn't stand to waste any extra words on him. Late one night, I came downstairs to grab some water and heard voices coming from the living room. I froze, recognizing my parents' tones, Mom's sharp and biting, Dad's low and pleading. Don't tell me that's the whole story, Mom said, her voice trembling with both anger and hurt. Because I don't believe you. Not anymore. It is, Dad said, but his hesitation was unmistakable. I crept closer, staying just out of sight but close enough to hear every word. No, Mom shot back. There's more. I know there is. You've been lying to me for 30 years, so don't pretend you've suddenly decided to come clean about everything now. I've told you the truth, Dad said weakly. Not all of it, Mom countered. You didn't just randomly pick a jewelry store, did you? It wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing. There was a reason, wasn't there? The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, waiting for Dad to respond. It wasn't random, he admitted finally, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Mom let out a bitter laugh, the sound cutting through the quiet like a knife. I knew it. I knew there was more. What was it then? Why that store? Dad sighed heavily, like the weight of his secrets was finally too much to bear. The owner, Mr. Patel, he was in a feud with Mark's family. Something about a business deal gone bad. Mark said he wanted to send a message to teach Patel a lesson. I didn't think we'd actually go through with it, but then things just spiraled. Mom's voice was icy when she responded. So this wasn't just a stupid mistake. It was personal, and you still went along with it. I didn't know it would go that far, Dad said quickly. I thought we'd break in, grab some stuff, and leave. I didn't know Mark was going to bring lighter fluid, or that Jason would actually use it. You didn't stop them, Mom said, her voice cracking. You didn't walk away. You were there, and you let it happen. I was scared, Dad said, his voice filled with desperation. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't want to lose my friends. Your friends? Mom spat. Your friends ruined that man's life. They hurt a firefighter. And you're telling me you stayed silent for 30 years because you didn't want to lose your friends? There was another long pause before Mom spoke again. Is there anything else you're hiding? Anything else you haven't told us? I've told you everything, Dad said, but his voice wavered. Don't lie to me, Mom said sharply. Not now. Not after all of this. I peeked around the corner and saw Dad sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. Mom stood in front of him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. There was one other thing, Dad said finally, his voice barely audible. Jason, he got caught a few years after the fire. Not for that, but for something else. He never said anything about us. He kept our names out of it. Mom's eyes widened, and she took a step back. He protected you? All this time? He did, Dad admitted. I don't know why. Maybe he felt guilty. Or maybe he just didn't want to drag us down with him. And Mark? Mom asked. I haven't heard from him in years, Dad said. Last I knew, he moved out west. I don't even know if he's still alive. Mom shook her head, a look of disbelief on her face. This isn't just about you anymore, she said. This affects all of us. Me, the kids. Do you even realize what you've done? I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Dad said, his voice breaking. That doesn't matter, Mom said coldly. What matters is that you lied. For decades. And now, our entire family is caught up in this mess. I didn't wait to hear any more. I backed away, quietly, and went back to my room, my heart pounding. The next morning, the tension in the house was worse than ever. Mom barely acknowledged Dad, and he spent most of the day avoiding all of us. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd overheard. The crime wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate, calculated. And the fact that one of Dad's friends had protected them for all these years only made it worse. It felt like every time I thought I had a handle on the situation, another layer of secrets was revealed, each one more devastating than the last. This wasn't just about a crime anymore. It was a tangled web of lies, betrayal, and misplaced loyalty that had been festering for 3 decades. I didn't know how, or if we'd ever untangle it. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The tension in the house had become unbearable. Jake had stopped responding to all of us, and the few times I tried calling him, it went straight to voicemail. Emily, always the mediator, was doing her best to keep the peace, but even she seemed drained. Mom was hanging on by a thread. She barely spoke, and when she did, it was only to us, never to Dad. Dad, for his part, had retreated into himself. He was always jumpy, like a man waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every time the phone rang, he froze, his eyes darting toward it like it was a bomb about to go off. I started noticing how he paced around the house late at night, or sat in the dark kitchen with a cup of coffee he never drank. It was exhausting, living in this state of perpetual unease. And yet, none of us could bring ourselves to address it. The knock on the door came one evening while we were having dinner. We all froze, forks suspended midair. I'll get it, Dad said quickly, standing up so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. Mom gave him a sharp look, but said nothing as he made his way to the door. I watched as he opened it, revealing a man in a dark suit holding a clipboard. Mr. Allen? The man asked, his voice calm but firm. That's me, Dad replied, his voice steady but his posture tense. My name is Daniel Price, the man said, extending a hand. I'm a private investigator. I'm looking into a series of cold cases, and I'd like to ask you a few questions about an old acquaintance of yours. My heart dropped. I didn't even need to hear the name to know who he was talking about. Dad hesitated, glancing back toward the dining room. Now's not really a good time, he said, his tone polite but clipped. I understand, the investigator said. This won't take long. There was a long pause before Dad finally stepped outside, closing the door behind him. I strained to hear their conversation, but their voices were muffled. Mom and Emily exchanged worried glances, while I sat frozen, my mind racing. When Dad finally came back inside, his face was pale, and his hands were trembling. Who was that? Mom asked, her voice sharp. Just someone asking about an old friend, Dad said, brushing past us and heading into the kitchen. What kind of friend? Mom pressed, following him. Dad didn't answer. He poured himself a glass of water, his back to us. Dad, I said, standing up and walking over to him. What's going on? He sighed heavily, setting the glass down and turning to face us. He was asking about Jason, he admitted finally. Apparently, they're reopening some of the cases he was connected to. They're looking into his old associates, trying to see if there's a connection. And you're one of those associates, Mom said, her voice cold. Dad nodded, his expression grim. That night, I found him sitting on the back porch, staring out into the dark yard. I hesitated for a moment before stepping outside and sitting down beside him. Are you okay? I asked softly. He let out a bitter laugh. What do you think? We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets. Have you been expecting this? I finally asked. Ever since Jason got caught, he admitted. I knew it was only a matter of time before someone came knocking. I just didn't think it would take this long. Why didn't you leave? I asked. Why didn't you run? He gave me a sad smile. I couldn't do that to you or your mom. Running would have meant leaving everything behind. And besides, where would I go? It's not like you can outrun your past. His words hung in the air, heavy and final. Do you think they'll find out? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with resignation. I don't know, but if they do, I'll face it. I've been running from this for 30 years. Maybe it's time to stop. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was even tenser than before. Mom was furious, pacing around the kitchen and muttering under her breath. Emily was unusually quiet, and I could tell she was trying to hold it together for everyone's sake. Dad tried to go about his day like normal, but it was obvious he was on edge. Every time the doorbell rang or the phone buzzed, he flinched. I couldn't stop thinking about the investigator and what he might find. The idea of our family being dragged into a police investigation was terrifying, and the thought of Dad going to prison was even worse. That evening, while Dad was out running errands, I sat down with Mom and Emily in the living room. What are we going to do? Emily asked, her voice filled with worry. We can't do anything, Mom said bluntly. This is his mess, and he's going to have to deal with it. But what if they arrest him? I asked. What happens to us then? Mom sighed, rubbing her temples. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know. The uncertainty was unbearable. None of us knew what the future held, but one thing was clear. The consequences of Dad's actions were finally catching up to him, and there was no escaping them now. The week after the private investigator's visit was suffocating. Dad was more withdrawn than ever, and the tension in the house felt like a living thing, coiled and ready to strike. Conversations were brief, eyes avoided, and every little noise seemed to put everyone on edge. It was during one of these strained dinners that Dad finally dropped another bombshell. I heard from Mark, he said suddenly, setting his fork down. The room went silent. Mom froze, her glass of water halfway to her lips, while Emily and I exchanged nervous glances. What do you mean you heard from Mark? Mom asked, her voice sharp. He messaged me, Dad admitted, on Facebook of all places. I hadn't thought about him in years, and then out of nowhere, there he was in my inbox. What did he say? Emily asked, her tone cautious. Dad hesitated, his eyes darting around the table like he was searching for an escape route. He said he's in trouble, that someone's been asking questions about the fire. Mom's face darkened. And you didn't think to mention this earlier? I wasn't sure if it was relevant, Dad said defensively. And honestly, I didn't want to worry you more than you already are. That ship sailed a long time ago. Mom shot back, her voice cold. Later that night, I found Dad in the garage, sitting on the old workbench he rarely used anymore. He looked up when I walked in, his face lined with exhaustion. What kind of trouble is Mark in? I asked, closing the door behind me. I don't know, he admitted. He didn't give me much detail. Just said he needed help and that he thought I'd understand. Do you think he told someone? Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know. Mark was always unpredictable. If he's desperate, who knows what he might have said or done. So, what are you going to do? He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. I've been thinking about going to the police. If Mark starts talking, it's only a matter of time before it all comes out anyway. Maybe it's better if I get ahead of it. The idea of Dad turning himself in was both terrifying and strangely comforting. On one hand, it felt like the right thing to do, an opportunity to finally put the past to rest. But on the other hand, the thought of him in handcuffs, of him being taken away, was almost too much to bear. You think they'll arrest you? I asked softly. They might, he said. But if they do, I'll deal with it. I've been running from this for long enough. The next morning, Dad was unusually quiet during breakfast. He seemed lost in thought, barely touching his food. Mom noticed too, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. What's going on? She asked finally. I'm thinking about going to the police, Dad said, his tone calm but firm. The room went still. Mom's jaw tightened, and Emily froze with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. Are you serious? Mom asked, her voice low and dangerous. Yes, Dad said, meeting her gaze. If Mark starts talking, it's only a matter of time before they come for me anyway. I'd rather face this on my own terms. Mom shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the table. You're just going to throw everything away? Our family? Our lives? I've already thrown enough away, Dad said quietly. This is the only way to make it right. Emily set her cup down, her expression conflicted. What happens to us if you go to jail? Have you thought about that? Of course I've thought about it, Dad said. But I can't keep dragging all of you through this. You deserve better. You're not just making this decision for yourself, Mom said, her voice trembling with anger. You're making it for all of us. And it's not fair. Dad didn't respond. He just sat there, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. That night, I found myself scrolling through Facebook, my curiosity getting the better of me. I searched for Mark, wondering what kind of trouble he might be in. His profile was sparse, with only a handful of posts and an outdated profile picture. But his most recent post, made just a few days ago, sent a chill down my spine. Asterisk, sometimes the past. Sometimes the past catches up to you no matter how far you run. Some mistakes don't stay buried. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The post was vague, but it didn't take a detective to connect the dots. Mark was feeling the pressure, and if he cracked, everything could unravel. I debated showing the post to Dad, but decided against it. He was already carrying enough, and this would only add to his stress. Instead, I took a screenshot, saving it just in case. The following day, Dad spent most of his time pacing around the house, checking his phone every few minutes. When I asked him what he was waiting for, he just shrugged, muttering something about answers. By late afternoon, he finally got what he was waiting for, another message from Mark. This time, it was a direct plea for help. We need to talk. Things are getting bad. You don't want to wait until it's too late. Dad showed me the message, his face pale. What do you think he means by that? He asked. I shrugged, my stomach twisting in knots. I don't know, but it sounds like he's desperate. He always was, Dad muttered. Desperation is what got us into this mess in the first place. So, are you going to talk to him? I asked cautiously. I don't know, Dad admitted. If I reach out, it could make things worse. But if I don't, he trailed off, his expression grim. That evening, I overheard Dad and Mom arguing again. What if he drags you down with him? Mom hissed. What if talking to him puts a target on our backs? I can't ignore him, Karen, Dad shot back. If he's about to spill everything, I need to know. Do you hear yourself? Mom snapped. You're putting our family at risk for a man who ruined your life 30 years ago. Dad didn't respond, but the look on his face said everything. He felt trapped, caught between loyalty to an old friend and the need to protect his family. The next morning, Dad decided to call Mark. He stepped out onto the back porch with his phone, leaving the door open just enough for me to hear snippets of the conversation. Mark, it's me, he said, his voice low. What's going on? There was a pause, and then a muffled voice on the other end. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was frantic. What do you mean they're asking questions? Dad said sharply. Who's they? Another pause. Damn it, Mark, Dad hissed. You should have come to me sooner. The conversation went on for a few more minutes before Dad hung up and came back inside, his face pale. Well, Mom asked, crossing her arms. He says he thinks the private investigator might be working for someone connected to Patel's family, Dad said. Apparently, they've been looking into the fire for years. Mom's eyes widened. Why now? After all this time? Because of Jason, Dad said grimly. His arrest must have opened up old wounds. And if they dig deep enough, they'll find you. I finished for him, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad nodded, his expression haunted. They'll find all of us. That night, Dad sat us down in the living room. Emily had come over after work, and Jake had reluctantly agreed to join via video call. I've made a decision, Dad said, his voice steady but somber. I'm going to the police. What? Jake exploded from the screen. You can't be serious. Dad, no, Emily said, her voice trembling. There has to be another way. There isn't, Dad said firmly. This is the only way to protect you. If they're coming for me, I'd rather face them head-on than wait for them to knock on our door. But what happens to us if you go to prison? Jake demanded. What happens to Mom? To the house? Have you even thought about that? I have, Dad said, his voice cracking. And I hate it, but I can't keep running from this. I won't drag you all down with me. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over us like a heavy blanket. As much as I hated the idea of losing him, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. Maybe this was the beginning of the end, of the lies, the fear, the endless waiting. But as I looked around at my family, their faces etched with worry and disbelief, I realized that no matter what happened next, we were far from being free of the past. The pressure in our house was reaching a breaking point. It was like living with a ticking time bomb, and every day felt like it brought us closer to detonation. Conversations were clipped, silences stretched on too long, and the air was thick with unspoken fears. Mom was barely eating. I'd catch her in the kitchen late at night, staring into a cold cup of tea, her eyes dark with sleeplessness. Emily had started coming over more often, bringing casseroles and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But even her calm demeanor was starting to crack. Jake had stopped responding to our group texts entirely, and when I pressed him, he admitted he was considering cutting ties until things blew over. I couldn't blame him. The stress was eating all of us alive. One night, Emily and I sat Dad down in the living room. Mom was upstairs pretending to sleep, but I knew she was listening. Dad looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale as he sat in his recliner, nursing a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. "Dad, we need to talk," Emily started, her tone gentle but firm. He sighed, setting the glass down. "I know what you're going to say. Then you know we're serious," she said, leaning forward. "This can't keep going like this. It's tearing us apart." "It's not that simple," Dad said, rubbing his temples. "If I go to the police, it'll ruin everything. Your mom, the house, everything we've built together. It'll all be gone." Emily shook her head. "It's already ruined, Dad. Look at us. Mom's a wreck, Jake's checked out, and I can't even focus at work because I'm so worried about what's going to happen. And what about Sam?" she added, gesturing to me. "He's barely keeping it together, too." Dad turned to me, his expression pained. "Is that true?" I hesitated, unsure of how honest I should be. But then I thought about the missed classes, the sleepless nights, the constant feeling of dread. "Yeah," I admitted. "It is." He looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. "I never wanted this for you. For any of you." "Then do something about it," Emily said. "Turn yourself in. Face the consequences. Because keeping this secret isn't just hurting you. It's destroying all of us." For a moment, he didn't say anything. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not good enough," Emily snapped, surprising both of us. She was usually the calm one, the peacemaker. Seeing her so angry was jarring. "Emily," Dad started, but she cut him off. "No, Dad. I'm serious. You can't keep stalling. This isn't going to go away just because you're hoping it will. The longer you wait, the worse it's going to get." I said, "I'll think about it." He barked, his voice rising for the first time. We both froze, stunned into silence. Dad rarely raised his voice, and when he did, it was usually out of frustration, not anger. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment, his tone softer now. I don't know what to do. I feel like no matter what choice I make, I'm going to hurt all of you." Emily reached over and took his hand. "We're already hurting, Dad," she said gently. "The only way to start healing is for you to take responsibility. It's the only way we'll ever move past this." The next few days were tense. Dad was quieter than usual, and every time I tried to talk to him, he just said he needed more time. Meanwhile, the private investigator kept making his rounds, talking to neighbors and old acquaintances. Each time I saw his car parked down the street, my stomach churned with anxiety. Mom started sleeping in the guest room, a silent but pointed statement that she couldn't bear to share a bed with Dad. Jake called me one night, his voice tense. "Look, I don't know what you guys are doing over there, but I can't deal with it anymore," he said. "I'm moving out. I just need some space." I wanted to argue with him, to tell him we needed him here, but I couldn't blame him. The stress was unbearable, and it was taking its toll on all of us. One morning, I woke up to find Dad sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. "What's that?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "A letter," he said, his voice hoarse. "To your mom. To all of you. In case I decide to. The thought of him turning himself in and leaving us behind made my chest tighten. But at the same time, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe this was the beginning of the end, the start of something new, even if it was painful. "You're really going to do it?" I asked cautiously. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up his pen and started writing. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but I'm starting to think it's the only way to make things right." As the days went on, the weight of the decision loomed over all of us. Every moment felt like it could be the one when Dad finally made his choice. But until then, we were stuck in limbo, waiting for the inevitable reckoning. And no matter how much I tried to prepare myself, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. It was a Tuesday morning just like any other. I woke up late, as usual, dragging myself downstairs for breakfast. The house was eerily quiet, but I didn't think much of it at first. Mom was probably out in the garden, and Dad was likely in the garage tinkering with something to take his mind off things. But as I stepped into the kitchen, I noticed a piece of paper on the counter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Dad's bold, slanted scrawl. I picked it up, my heart pounding as I read the words. I've gone to the police station to turn myself in. I can't keep running from my past, and I can't keep putting this burden on all of you. I love you all more than anything, and I hope someday you'll understand why I had to do this. Please take care of each other. The note slipped from my hands and fluttered to the floor. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. He'd actually done it. The fallout was swift and brutal. By the time Mom came back inside, the phone was already ringing off the hook. News spread fast in a small town, and it didn't take long for word to get out that Dad had confessed to a decades-old arson and robbery. Mom read the note in silence, her hands trembling. When she finally looked up, her face was a mixture of anger and sadness. "Why now?" she whispered, more to herself than to me. I didn't have an answer. The local news picked up the story that evening. Former town hero confesses to decades-old crime. The headline read. They showed Dad's mugshot, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with resignation. Suddenly, our family wasn't just dealing with the private consequences of his actions. We were thrust into the public eye. Strangers whispered about us in the grocery store, neighbors gave us pitying looks, and Emily's co-workers started avoiding her at the office. Jake, who had already moved out, called me that night. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice unusually soft. "Not really," I admitted. "Are you?" He laughed bitterly. "I don't even know what to feel anymore. Angry? Sad? Relieved? It's like I hated the waiting, but now that it's out, it's worse." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah, same." Mom didn't take it well at first. She was furious. At Dad, at the media, at the situation we were all forced into. For the first few days, she barely spoke, alternating between pacing the house and sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted. The anger started to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve. "I'm not going to let this destroy us," she said one evening as we sat together in the living room. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire in her eyes. "We've been through too much to let this tear us apart." Her strength was a lifeline, and slowly, we began to pick up the pieces. Visiting Dad in jail was surreal. The first time I saw him in the orange jumpsuit, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of his guilt had finally crushed him. "Hey kid," he said, his voice hoarse. "Hey," I replied, sitting down across from him. The plexiglass between us made everything feel even more surreal. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "For everything." "I know," I said. "But I still don't get why you didn't tell us you were going. We could have, I don't know, done something." He shook his head. "There was nothing you could have done. This was something I had to do on my own." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. "Do you regret it?" I asked finally. He thought for a long time before answering. "No," he said quietly. "For the first time in 30 years, I feel like I can breathe. But I regret what it's doing to all of you. I didn't mean to drag you into this." The whispers and stares didn't stop. If anything, they got worse as the trial date approached. Emily started getting questions at work about whether she knew him all along, and Jake confessed that his girlfriend's parents had asked if they felt safe around him. I started skipping classes more often, unable to deal with the sideways glances and hushed conversations. It felt like we were being punished for something we didn't even do. One day, I came home to find Mom sitting at the dining table with a stack of old photo albums. She was flipping through them, her face soft with nostalgia. "What are you doing?" I asked, sitting down beside her. "Reminding myself of the good times," she said with a small smile. "It's easy to forget, with everything going on, that your dad isn't just this." She gestured vaguely, as if this encompassed all the pain and chaos of the past few weeks. "He's still the man I fell in love with. The man who built this family with me." Her words stayed with me long after she went to bed. For all his mistakes, for all the pain his actions had caused, Dad was still my dad. And as much as I hated what he'd done, I couldn't bring myself to hate him. The trial loomed on the horizon, a storm we couldn't avoid. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out, and while it was messy and painful, it also felt like a chance to start over. Maybe, just maybe, we'd find a way to rebuild. Together. It's been 4 months since Dad walked into the police station and confessed. For months since our family's world tilted on its axis. And while the dust has started to settle, the cracks left behind are still raw and visible. Dad remains in county jail, awaiting trial. His lawyer has been working on a plea deal, but nothing is certain yet. The legal process is slow and excruciating, dragging us all along with it. In the meantime, we've each been trying to find our footing, though it feels like we're walking on uneven ground. Jake hasn't come home since the confession. He barely speaks to any of us, and when he does, it's short and clipped. I don't know how to process this, he said during one of our rare phone calls. How do you come to terms with the fact that your hero wasn't who you thought he was? I tried to talk him into visiting Dad, but he shut me down. What's the point? He asked bitterly. He made his choice, and now he has to live with it. So do we. Emily, on the other hand, has taken a different approach. She visits Dad every Sunday, bringing him updates on the family and talking about anything except the looming trial. He needs someone to remind him that he's still human, she told me once. That he's still Dad, even if he screwed up. I've only gone to see him a handful of times. Each visit is emotionally draining, and I leave feeling more conflicted than ever. How do you reconcile the man who taught you how to ride a bike with the man who committed a crime that destroyed lives? Mom has been the strongest and the most fragile of us all. She started therapy a few weeks after Dad's confession, and it seems to be helping, though she still has her moments. One night, I found her sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, staring at the family portrait that used to hang over the mantel. She had taken it down after Dad's confession, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to put it away. I keep wondering, she said softly, not looking at me, if I missed the signs. If there was something I could have done differently, something that would have made him tell me the truth sooner. It's not your fault, I said, sitting down beside her. She gave me a sad smile. I know that, logically, but it doesn't make it any easier. We sat there for a while, the silence between us heavy but comforting in its own way. As for me, I'm still trying to figure out where I stand. Some days, I'm angry at Dad, at the situation, at the universe for putting us through this. Other days, I just feel numb, like I'm going through the motions without really being present. School has become my escape, though even that feels tainted by everything that's happened. I've stopped telling people my last name, hoping to avoid the inevitable questions and whispers. It doesn't always work, but it's better than nothing. One of my professors pulled me aside after class a few weeks ago. If you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open, she said, her tone kind but pitying. I thanked her and left as quickly as I could. The last thing I wanted was more pity. The trial is set to start in a few weeks, and the anticipation is unbearable. The prosecutor is pushing for prison time, arguing that Dad's confession doesn't erase the harm he caused. His lawyer is fighting for leniency, pointing to his clean record since the crime and his willingness to come forward voluntarily. We've been warned that the trial will dredge up everything, every detail of the crime, every mistake Dad ever made. The thought of sitting in that courtroom, hearing strangers dissect our family's darkest secrets, makes my stomach churn. But despite everything, there's a strange sense of relief in knowing that the truth is finally out. No more hiding. No more secrets. The other day, Emily and I went through some old photo albums, reminiscing about happier times. We laughed at pictures of us as kids. Jake in his superhero costumes, Emily's cringy middle school haircuts, me covered in mud from head to toe after one of my many adventures in the backyard. When we came across a picture of Dad holding me on his shoulders, Emily paused. You know, she said quietly, no matter what happens, he's still our dad. He's still the guy who taught me how to drive and stayed up all night helping me with my science fair project. That doesn't just go away. I nodded, though the knot in my chest didn't loosen. I know, but it's hard to separate the two sometimes. It is, she agreed, but I think we have to try. Otherwise, what's the point? I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if Dad will go to prison or if we'll ever fully heal from this. But I do know one thing. Secrets have a way of coming out, no matter how deeply you bury them. And when they do, they can tear everything apart. But maybe, just maybe, they can also make room for something new. Something honest. Something real. Only time will tell.